All right, as people come into the session, we'll give it to about a minute after the hour before getting started, just to make sure everyone can get in the session.
Perfect.
All right, well, let's get started. Happy Friday, everyone. Thank you for taking the time out of the middle of your Friday to join this kickoff session. Really appreciate it. Just a little bit of background. Go to the next slide. Actually, that'd be better for this intro. Just so you know, my name's John Paralisi. I haven't met most of you before. I am the Spark project director who came on board in December to help detail out the process and lead it to fruition. One thing to note up front is that my role is really purely a process role. From the standpoint of being an expert around the content or the decision-making around setting priorities. That's going to be the role of the panel, all the panelists here, as under the leadership of the chairs. And so appreciate all of you being willing to be involved in this. You know, this is a really important area that could create a lot of value for Kansas over the long term, as we'll get into. And all of you were selected because of your perspectives and expertise. And although at the start of this process, you know, today it may seem like we may be kind of talking a little bit more than having kind of back and forth conversations, that's going to change pretty significantly, certainly on the second half of this. We just want to make sure that we're able to spend some time up front, kind of level setting everyone. So just as a kind of a guideline in terms of what we're going to be going through generally, we're going to start with an overview around the purpose of the panel, give the members a chance to introduce themselves and to introduce themselves to each other, talk a little bit about rules of engagement. Then we're going to walk through the context, you know, talk about the funding, you know, what's the kind of size of the pie that we're looking at here. A little bit at the landscape and, you know, that the last point around where Spark suggests we at least start with our focus. You know, this project or this process has been going on for months now. And so over the course of those months, even though the panels are kicking off now, you know, things like listening tours and other submissions that have been coming in, as well as guidance from the Spark committee itself, we've kind of honed in on a few areas, and those are the areas where we really did a lot of analysis that went into the pre-reads. Not to say those are the only places where the panel can go in terms of looking at where to prioritize, but just wanted to say that up front because we did kind of focus in on a few areas. And we're going to get a chance at the end to kind of really revisit that and talk about that as a group. Part 3 is going to be discussing current needs and gaps. You probably all have read the pre-reads. We'll go through some of the highlights from that as a means of just summarizing the current situation from an economic standpoint in Kansas, as well as some of the areas where gaps exist. And then finally, or not finally, in 4, we're really going to be able to roll up our sleeves and have a collaborative session using an online tool around, you know, people being able to talk about areas of focus as they see it, and even do a little bit of voting to that end, so that we can try and hone in our focus. One thing to note is on the submission template, we really didn't specify the areas where people needed to target their submissions. So, we can remain open to changing the focus as we move over time based on what we're seeing or based on, the brainstorming from the advisory panel itself. That was just meant to be a starting point. And then at the end, we'll talk about, what comes next and some homework going forward, as well as some resources that the panel and the panelists can reach to. One other thing to note is that, going to be a lot of chance to be able to talk at the end and address questions at the end. But if anyone has questions or comments along the way, feel free to pipe in. And if it makes sense to address them along the way, we can do that. Next slide. From the orientation last week, I think most people would have seen this, but this funnel is really a way to kind of visualize the process that each one of the panels is going through. So we want to start with a common understanding of the critical needs in terms of economic revitalization. And then we want to be able to get, as many good ideas as we can against those areas going into the funnel. And like I said, there have been listening tours and proposals coming in for months now, long before I came on board. We've made sure that we've gone back to all the folks who had submitted ideas before to try and have them put them into kind of the common submission format, as well as ideas going forward that submission forms open until the middle of February. But the intent is even past that, as the advisory panel itself brainstorms on ideas, that those ideas as well would be portrayed in that same format, just so we can make apples to apples comparisons, both within the panel, and then once the Spark committee is looking at ideas across the panels, is able to look at them with somewhat of a common lens. And the other thing to point out here is that, all of these numbers are just illustrative. They're just there really to portray the fact that we have a wide funnel at the start, trying to really bring in the best ideas. We'll filter based on ones that, focus on the ones that really fit. And with regards to that, each one of the panels is a little bit different. The economic revitalization panel is a little unique in the sense that it is the broadest area, as well as it's probably the one that, when you look at the allowability guidelines from Treasury, probably be the one where there will need to be a decent amount of shaping around ideas in order to have them really align. At the same time, if something's a really great idea, even if we can't get it to kind of really fit, we want to make sure that we capture those ideas, because this isn't the only source of funding going forward. So pretty committed to make sure that we keep all the ideas within kind of the institutional memory. Then the panel will work through a structured process of being able to score the ideas against impact and feasibility and other criteria to understand which ones rise to the top, and then do some shaping around kind of the final portfolio in terms of the recommendation that it wants to make to the Spark committee. Next slide. So in terms of the deliverables, and there's even one kind of farther on the left-hand side here, is that even the ideas that didn't make it through the filter, we're capturing all those ideas, and we'll probably, at least at a summary level, going to share them with the Spark committee as well. In terms of all the viable ideas that really fit, we will have profiles of all of those that we'll supply. And then allow the Spark committee to see how those ideas scored. So not just, what rose to the top, but, how they ranked on various criteria. And then finally, the overall recommendation coming from the panel to the Spark committee. And the thought on that is that's going to be the start of a discussion between the panel chairs and the Spark committee, because intentionally, there's probably going to be more things going to the Spark committee from each one of the panels that can be funded in aggregate. But since the intent is really to be able to make trade-offs, and make sure that these funds are being used as wisely as possible. The goal is to get a lot of good ideas on the table so that they can make some of those trade-offs at that level. So speaking of the Spark Committee, these are the guiding principles that even kind of mid last year, the Spark Committee put forward in terms of how they thought about Spark and how to think about the investment of these ARPA funds. And so these are going to be really important because these are going to be maybe the primary lens really through which the Spark Committee is going to be looking at what comes to it. So, just to summarize a few of them, prioritize sustainable programs and investments through one-time use of funds versus substantial expansion of existing services. That's really important. Looking at this as, where can you make catalytic investments rather than things that are going to require kind of, ongoing budgetary requirements. Also understand, how, what the overall funding landscape is and where you might be able to leverage other local agency funds, other types of funds to make sure that we're maximizing the use of these funds, because these funds are a little bit more discretionary than a lot of other sources of funds. And so because of that value, that flexibility around these funds, make sure that we're really targeting ideas against the sweet spot of these funds where they can be put to best use. And then the big lens is really fostering long-term systemic impact for Kansas and Kansans. With the point of a lot of the previous funding that's come from Treasury has really been tagged around dealing with the COVID emergency. So, very specific around what a lot of those funds needed to be spent on. There's more flexibility around these funds, and hence, the opportunity to think a little bit more strategically around things that are going to set up Kansas for long-term success. Consider equitable opportunities outcomes, and that is also built into allowability, that lens as well. So these funds are discretionary, but there still are some guidelines around how they need to be used. Enable flexibility within the investment strategy. So a way to think about this is that in some cases, we may be looking at a specific project. In a lot of cases, we may be really looking at an area of need with ideas of types of projects or programs that could go against those needs, and whether they should, though, coming up with solutions in those areas should be the most important places to focus. Once again, also having examples of here are some primary candidates of really the types of projects we want to go after, and maybe even some specific ones, and ensure that the results are measurable over time. So I'm going to stop talking for a little bit. I'll let Tian take over. Tian, as well as Representative Tarwater, are the two chairs for this panel. So the hope here was to, give everyone a chance to kind of introduce themselves. And with that, I'll let Tian take it over.
Thank you, John. Well, first, want to pass along Representative Tarwater's apologies on last-minute scheduling conflict that popped up that he had to tend to, and also wanted to pass along his gratitude for everybody that's on this panel working with us on this. And for myself, Tin Nguyen, really looking forward to working with all of you on a professional perspective, or actually to start with the personal side of things. I'm married, happily married for 9 years, 3 kids. Actually have my eldest turning 6 today. She's our daughter. Then I got a 4-year-old son and a 2-year-old son. Professionally, I've been blessed and have the opportunity to form and create a investment group with my 2 best friends from high school. And collectively right now, we're mainly in the automotive space. We own car dealerships. We have other investments as well, but collectively we have roughly about $100 million in annual revenue and about 150 employees here, all of that here in our great state. With that, then I just kind of want to open it up to everybody else for introductions, and really just looking forward to working with all of you.
Should we go through kind of one at a time? Let's how about we go to Senator, and I'm sorry if I get the last name pronunciation wrong, Clays?
That'll work. Hi, Senator Clays, represent Salina and Abilene, Salina and Dickinson counties in the Kansas Senate. Good to be here.
Thank you. Lona Duval?
Hi, this is Lana Duvall. I apologize. I'm just getting back to my office, so I will be getting on my computer. I am Finney County Economic Development Corporation President and CEO. Been in this position for 11 years and looking forward to working with everybody.
Great. Representative Sawyer?
Yeah, this is State Representative Tom Sawyer. I'm the House Minority Leader. I represent the 95th House District, which is part of Southwest Wichita. It's the kind of Delano area, if you know Wichita. Glad to be here.
Great, thank you. Andrew? Nave?
Afternoon, everyone. Andrew Nave. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Greater Wichita Partnership, which is a regional EDO here in South Central Kansas. I've been here for going on 6 years now, but longtime Kansan. Before that, I spent more than a decade up in the Johnson County area, all in local economic development. So appreciate joining the committee.
Great. Tim McKee?
Hello, I'm Tim McKee. I'm the CEO of the Olathe Chamber of Commerce. Been in this role for about 10 years as chamber president, handled economic development prior to that and still do in Olathe for now 22 years. Prior to that, I was in Overland Park doing economic development for about 4 years prior to that. So about 25 years of economic development here in Johnson County.
Thanks. Ryan Flickner?
Good afternoon. I'm Ryan Flickner, Senior Director of Advocacy at Kansas Farm Bureau, which is a general farm organization with about 110,000 members statewide. We do have a presence in all 105 counties in Kansas and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Brett Leopold?
Hi, my name is Brett Leopold. I'm the president of ITC Great Plains. We're a transmission-only electric utility, and we've invested about $500 million in high-voltage electric transmission in the state of Kansas, and continue to look for opportunities to make additional investments to enhance the reliability and economics of the Kansas and the regional electric grid. So I look forward to working with all of you on this project. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Sam Sackett?
Hey, good afternoon. It's good to see some familiar faces on here. Looking forward to our weeks, months ahead. But I work at Spirit Aerosystems and have been here for about 11 years now. Spirit, for those not familiar, is historically in the last several years, we've been the state's largest private sector employer. And we have a pretty vast supply chain that touches every congressional district across the state. I think we've had about 500 Kansas suppliers. That's both direct and indirect suppliers in terms of products and services combined. Before working at Spirit, I was worked on Capitol Hill for a little over 10 years. And so I don't have an economic development background, but I've had the privilege of working with a lot of businesses and industries throughout my career.
Great. Thanks, Sam. Matt Condon?
Hi, everybody. Matt Condon. I'm founder and CEO of Bardavon Health Innovations. We're a healthcare technology and services business headquartered here in Overland Park. We have about 250 associates. We did just finish a Series C a couple of months ago, so we're scheduled to hire another 160 this year. Was chair of the Greater Kansas City Chamber of Commerce a few years ago. I do sit on the board for the Kauffman Foundation too, so some adjacent or parallels. And then Tim, I appreciated your comments. I'm the father of four, 3 daughters and a son, and been married here 22 years. Live here in Fairway, so great to be with you guys. Excited about it.
Great. Well, thank you. Appreciate it. Perfect attendance. So, that's a great start. So thank you, everyone. and also I won't have them go through and introduce themselves, but, in terms of support, there's a pretty extensive support staff from recovery office, KLRD, the key points of contact are listed here, as well as consulting resources from BCG and Widow O'Brien's. And I think in this area in particular, Widow O'Brien's is going to be really important because, as I mentioned, I think it's a broad area, but this is a place where probably the allowability and being able to be creative around the allowability is going to be pretty important. So the good thing is that, they are actively engaged in this process and can assist the panel as we go through this.
Hey, John, I do want to take a minute and turn it over to Bill Pickard. Bill is actually one of the Spark committee members, and he's joined us today. So, Bill, if you want to introduce yourself, we would love that. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to do that. I appreciate you guys letting me sit in. I'm very anxious to see this process get started. We've been waiting several months as a Spark committee to get this off the ground, and my goal is just to kind of know as much about the process going into it as I can, not to influence or try to in any way input in terms of what's going on here, but I just wanted to kind of understand some of the information you're getting and some of the deliberations, and I'm going to try to join as many of the committee meetings as I can, but I'm not going to be able to make them all. So, and I've got 4 kids, 3 daughters and a son. So I know what having the youngest as a son is like. So, but happy to be here, and I'm really very appreciative of the commitment that each of you have made to help us in steering the Spark committee, making a good sound decisions in economic revitalization of the state. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate it. So continuing to move on, for the folks who are on the orientation sessions, and I think there's most of you, I went through this then. I'm not going to try and go through it in an incredible amount of details, but in order to kind of start through this slide, which really portrays kind of the entire process from end to end at every level. If you go under advisory panels, in the row that is meetings, we've done the orientations, which are general orientations, and we're starting to do the kickoff. So today, 2 of the panels, including this one, are having their kickoff sessions. The other 2 will be having their kickoff sessions on Monday. And generally, the approach is to, one, have a situation assessment, so that we can collectively kind of have a common view around where the needs are. And then be able to go into, here are the areas that we want to be able to focus on. And at the same time, the submission form is open. And so starting to get more ideas, some of them submitted a while ago, some of them just being submitted now, as well as, ideas that the panel itself comes up with, kind of brainstorming itself around opportunities in those areas, being able to filter them and then score them. And then, looking at the scoring and, some portfolio considerations, deciding, what's the portfolio recommendation to bring up to the Spark committee itself. So that timeline that I just walked through is really February and March, with the thought being that in early April, that's when the chairs will be able to have discussions around those recommendations with the Spark committee. And the thought at that point is, and once again, the Spark committee, if this works correctly, should be getting more ask for funding in aggregate that can be funded just so they can make trade-offs. And one of the comments that I've heard is, any idea can look good in isolation. But the issue is, when I say yes to something, I'd like to know what I'm saying no to. So being able to look at it in an integrated sense is pretty important given what the objectives are that the Spark committee put forward. So in April, during those discussions, the intent is that there would be, back and forth discussions probably between the Spark committee and the advisory panels, with further asks and requests, and that the Spark committee itself will be able to go through a prioritization exercise so that by early May, it will have a integrated set of priorities that it wants to put forward to the State Finance Council. And that leaves a little bit of extra time in the May, June timeframe. If we need to do further detailing, we can. The thing I'll note about this, it's aggressive timeline. We think it's doable. As a result, and since as we've seen everyone's from all sorts of different locations, we're going to do all of this on a virtual backbone. It may be that everyone won't be able to make every session. We're doing good so far though, but our goal as a support group is going to be to make sure that these are all recorded and streamed, and that anyone who can't make a session, will work with them to make sure that they don't miss a beat in the context of the entire process.
Hey, John, we had a question in the chat about if future meetings have been set. I know we sent out that survey with everybody's availability. This was our first meeting. We're trying to align everybody's availability for our initial brainstorming meeting. So I think we have slides covering that later, but wanted to get that addressed in the chat. Once we finalize all those meetings, obviously you'll get the support documents and the meeting invites sent out to you for calendar placekeeper. Is there anything else, John, that I left out?
That's a good point. I mean, and we're going to try. I mean, in an ideal world, we'd be able to set all of the meetings. That's why we're asking for availability going out a bit. Hopefully, at the very least, the next 2 sessions. So that is the intent, and probably middle. We probably won't be able to finalize those until early to middle next week. But that's when you'll start probably on the next 2 meetings, get a feel for when we're targeting.
Thank you,
But
John.
generally, if you look at, go to the next slide. If you look at this slide, this shows kind of based on the availabilities that we've seen to date, probably, when they might drop. And so, we'd need to just kind of double check these and make sure, but this generally is what the cadence would look like. And it flows down kind of the cadence that I talked about before. We're going to get a chance to talk a lot more about the next meeting towards the end of this as a preview. But this first meeting, the intent really is introduce the process, the team, the engagement model, build that shared understanding of current needs. For that, we're just going to really go through some highlights of what you already saw in your pre-reads, but just to kind of get the juices flowing, and then have an interactive session so that we can align on, talking about and voting on some of those areas, just to understand where the panelists' thoughts are with regards to the most important areas of need. Next slide. So, this is a new process. And I come from most recently from the construction industry. And, every time we did a project, it tended to be new to the world design, new to the world team. And so the only thing that we knew was that no matter how good our plan was on day 0, it would be obsolete in some way on day 1. And so we needed to adjust. And, what we ended up finding when we looked at the projects that were the most successful, it was basically the ones that did the best job of really quickly understanding where they were off and adjusting. So given that, since this is a new process, we've done our best to try and detail it out, but the only thing I know is that we're probably going to need to, make some adjustments as we go. So, I would ask for kind of input from everyone around that and their thoughts as we go through this, as well as for kind of patience and flexibility, and at times, your grace around us as we kind of adapt as we go. Additionally, each one of these panels is coming from a very different standpoint, and so they all have some unique aspects to them. I mentioned before, generally there's that learning curve we're going to be going on, and we're moving at a pretty fast pace. Economic revitalization, as I mentioned before, is a little unique in that it's a really broad topic with a less defined scope, and it's also going to have allowability constraints, but it has enormous potential for Kansas. And so that's kind of the way in which, this panel is going to be a little different. So honing in on the kind of areas we want to focus on, still being open to what we see from all the submissions, which may actually even change how we think about the areas of focus. And then really, understanding the allowability around how we can shape great ideas to fit is going to be pretty important. I talked a little bit around the scheduling issue, appreciate your commitment to this. And in reality, probably not everyone's going to be able to make every meeting. And once again, we commit to helping people stay within the flow. And that, once again, the goal here is to try and reach consensus, although sure, there's going to be a lot of discussion along the way, and we encourage all of that discussion because, everyone's on here because they have expertise, different perspectives. So make sure that we bring them all to the table. On the next slide, and then before going into the next session, I'll stop a little bit because, we've been talking a lot. We talked a little bit around the time commitment. Participation, once again, definitely looking for people to engage and collaborate, particularly as we get more into this and start talking about ideas and brainstorming. And the other thing that we mentioned is that just due to the nature of this, the fact it's being recorded and streamed, when you want to speak up, please identify yourself. That'll make it easier for folks to track, particularly people who listen to the recording. And then the other thing is realize that this is a broad topic area and people may end up having areas where they have a conflict of interest. The only thing that we really ask there is just flag it when we get to that point. And if it's we're voting on something that, is very specifically something where you have a conflict of interest, though it probably won't come to that in a lot of areas. It may be at a level higher than that, abstain from voting. From a support standpoint, we're here to support, and we're going to make sure that, and we're even going to have a team site dedicated to all the members of this panel, and you'll be able to access materials and resources there and know who to reach out to for support, and don't hesitate to do that. So the next thing I'm going to get into is really talking about just the funding context to date and what we're talking about in terms of the overall pie. I guess before we go into that, I'd stop. Any questions from here? I see that there are a couple in the chat.
Hey, John, quick question. You mentioned earlier if there's a potential conflict that we need to abstain from voting. Are we supposed to abstain from the discussions as well?
No, I don't think so. I think you just acknowledge that, it may be an area where you have some interest, but because of that, you may also at the same time have a perspective. So.
Okay, roger that. Thank you.
Let's see, there are a couple other things in the chat. Got it. Okay, I will keep going then. So in terms of the funding, just a couple slides here, really, there have been, a lot of funds from the federal government. A lot of them, as I mentioned before, up until now, were really tagged around dealing with the COVID emergency, and were very specifically targeted against very specific areas with a lot of allowability constraints. This set of funds that Spark has been looking at is $1.6 billion of funds overall that have more flexibility around them, and they may be somewhat linked. There may be synergies between this set of funds to other sets of funds. For instance, the funds that went straight to local municipalities and towns and cities, as well as potentially the infrastructure bill, although the focus of that is still being defined somewhat. Now, within that, if you look at the right, of that 1.6 billion, some of it has already been allocated. So really what we're looking at is $731 million of unallocated funds. Now that may grow a little bit more when some of the areas where funds have been allocated previously, might come back into this, but generally, that is the kind of pot of funds that the Spark Committee is going to be thinking about and trying to optimize as it's seeing the recommendations coming up from the 4 advisory panels. Next slide. This slide just has a lot of detail really around where the funds, next slide. Okay. Have been allocated to date. And go to the next slide. And this slide really talks to the areas of kind of core focus, or at least, initial focus for economic revitalization. As I mentioned before, one thing that really distinguishes this advisory panel is this is super broad area. And so some of this shaping has come from the Spark Committee itself in terms of identifying areas of interest. Some of it's come from understanding allowabilities. And a lot of it really has come from the what's come out of the listening tours, as well as other submissions around areas of need. So the 3 areas were really around economic recovery, growth and competitiveness, which is around workforce development, as well as around, investments around innovation. And then infrastructure and quality, specifically water and sewer infrastructure is allowable for this set of funds, as well as, housing availability, has been an issue that is has been cited, over the course of all the submissions I saw from last year and the listening sessions as a key issue that, certainly is impacting business growth in certain areas of Kansas. Once again, we'll see where we end up focusing going forward. This was kind of where we put a lot of our effort, though, in terms of pulling together the situation assessment and the fact packs. But, it's up to the panel to decide kind of really, if there are any other additional areas of focus or where to really focus in on here.
John, I have a clarifying question.
Sure.
Of that $731 million that you showed on the previous slide, are those funds that are to be allocated across the 4 different focus areas from the advisory panels, or is that an allocation that's supposed to be focused on economic revitalization?
Across the 4 areas.
Okay. And is there a high level sort of sub allocation of that amount that the committees or the advisory panels are asked to weigh in on, or are we not? Is that really a later decision for the Spark Committee?
Yeah, the thought was, and we contemplated that, of whether we'd want to give kind of ranges of targets for each one of the panels, and the fact that it might be different by panel. But we kind of intentionally waiting a little bit until we get into the middle of the process to make that, assertion based on kind of what we're seeing come out. But the goal would be, for there to be, say, and this is just throwing out an illustrative number, maybe like $1.3 billion worth of funding opportunities that are all incredibly, valuable going up to the Spark Committee so that they can make trade-offs. And I guess the last thing I'd say is that even if something didn't get funded through this, there's a pretty good chance that, other funding vehicles or, even the infrastructure bill when it comes down the path, or any other, anything else that comes down, those ideas won't get lost. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think that, and I can see pros and cons in kind of doing it both ways. Obviously, it's helpful for any group to understand what their
Sure.
target is, what they're kind of trying to stay within for their recommendations. And I understand you've made it very clear that we're going to have a lot more projects and initiatives than we'll have funding for. So maybe in that sense, it doesn't really matter. But if there was a general sense from the Spark committee that they were going to want to put a certain allocation, a certain amount of the funds toward each of those buckets, that could also help understand.
Yeah.
Like, are we talking, $100 million that they want to apply toward economic revitalization, or is it more on the $500 million? I mean, there's a broad range that you could pursue and have very different outcomes in terms of what this advisory panel would make recommendations on based on what we have to work with.
Yeah, that's totally true. That's a good call out. And we've been thinking about that ourselves. We wanted to kind of get a little bit engaged, and there'll still be time for being able to provide that kind of guidance. So that it doesn't necessarily, in a timely enough manner that the panels don't go down any false trails. We just haven't had that discussion with the Spark committee yet, but the plan was to have that discussion.
Hey, Sam, with what little I do know, and John, I'm wrong on this too, but these funds, even though we're looking at them, I mean, the state could, from the appropriations committee or somebody else, come in and say, hey, we're not going through the panels, this is needed. I mean, as you can see, they've spent half of the funds already based on needs. And so it's not like it's all going to come to us. But from my position of where I'm sitting in the conversations that I've had, there's 4 panels, and if you equally distribute this between the 4, I don't think that would happen. And if we were to skew for one panel to have recommendations more than the other, I would bet my own dollars on it that the economic revitalization panel will actually get a larger share than some of the others, not because we're more important, it's just that because we have a larger scope that we have to address compared to all the others where they're very specific.
Well stated. Thank you.
And that would be my guess too. The one kind of wrinkle in it is how do the allowability constraints impact this area? But the other thing to keep in mind is, there may be a way to be able to fund well over $1 billion worth of ideas coming out of us, depending upon how we look at, other sources of funds that could have synergy with ideas coming from here. So, make sense? Great. Next slide. So, this is just kind of one lens to think about kind of recovery and resilience, which has been kind of a broad theme for these ARPA funds. So, part of the lens to use is thinking about, offsetting negative economic impacts of COVID-19, helping businesses that are impacted in the allowability. There is some of that saying want to make kind of important investments, but to the extent that they're focused on areas that have been adversely impacted, it certainly falls more easily within allowability. But there are a variety of ways of thinking about it and shaping things around that. And then from a resilience standpoint, we need to be thinking about, how do we bring new people and businesses who are equipped to handle challenges of the future, right? So very forward looking. My background, I didn't mention it before, is, my background is in strategy and growth in the private sector. So that definitely is, I am content neutral, but that is probably the perspective that I bring to a lot of these things personally. Some key questions to consider on the next slide. What types of initiatives would help Kansans recover from the remaining economic impact of COVID-19? Like I said, that's where it hews the most closely to the allowability. Given COVID-19's uneven impacts, but initiatives strengthen resiliency and growth opportunities for disproportionately impact communities, individuals, industries, geographies, a lot of ways of looking at that. That's where some of the shaping can come in. And really thinking, and I know, and if I don't say it, Bill being one of the Spark committee members, is that, this really needs to be thinking about building a foundation for long-term economic growth for Kansas. So, I've heard it said, I'd like to be 10 years from now looking back at the investments that were made here and being able to point to them and saying, yeah, that was a really catalytic investment for us putting ourselves on a path to kind of this better future that we're in. I don't know, Bill, if you want to kind of chime in there or not, or whether I covered it well enough.
No, I think you did a great job there, John. I would, generally agree from a personal standpoint that economic revitalization is, in fact, one of the key things we need to be looking at as a state. There's been a tremendous amount of money allocated to health education through the CARES Act, as well as designated money in the ARPA. Not to say there isn't more to be done, but I really think economic revitalization is important. And another, I think, a key factor that the committee's looking at is trying to figure out ways to leverage the state money with local city and county money. As you saw on the earlier slide, there was $1 billion allocated to those entities throughout the state, and I think there's going to be a strong emphasis on trying to create an expectation of a certain level of matching by the local governments to match or to at least come alongside what the state is being asked to do with its funds. And also, that money that's already been spent, 500 of it, million of it was assigned and dedicated for the Department of Labor to reimburse the fraudulent claims of the unemployment insurance fund. And so that was taken out of our hands before this whole process started. And then in December, the committee agreed or approved $150 million for some education relief for individual families, low-income families, as well as $100 million for economic development type activities. So I would tell you there's $100 million already been spent on economic development. So, but there's a lot more opportunities, I think, in the state. I'm anxious to see what we come up with or what you guys come up with ultimately for us to consider.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. One point I may have glossed over a little bit on that slide where it showed the 731 million on the right-hand side remaining. On the left-hand side, it showed just the scale of all the funding to date, right? And a lot of that is focused in on, areas around dealing with the COVID crisis on health and education side, and somewhat on the broadband side and other areas. And granted, some of those investments were kind of very, urgent investments in order to address areas of need, but they also helped, kind of create some new platforms in those areas as well. So this set of funds probably is one of the first chances to really focus on it from an economic revitalization standpoint. If you go kind of catch us back up, keep going. Keep going. Great. So, this is the section where, once again, there was an incredible amount of detail and facts in the pre-reads that you got. So this section is really just meant to kind of summarize some of the areas that we looked at. And some of the slides that follow are really just some kind of highlights around what the data is showing from an economic standpoint. In terms of the areas, you jumped ahead. Great. Looking at GDP growth, comparing it to other states, where are we in terms of jobs and unemployment, and how has that looked across geographies and across industries? Talent, looking at migration, particularly out-migration issues for Kansas, as well as skill issues, right? And particularly skills with regards to, are we creating the skills for industries of the future? Innovation, entrepreneurship, the whole, innovation ecosystem, places like advanced manufacturing, upskilling, reskilling, community assets, housing stock was huge, housing affordability, water infrastructure, business competitiveness, understanding the competitiveness of various businesses and current situation against each other within Kansas and across geographies. Now you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So, I don't think, this data, hopefully, of the information that was in the pre-read wasn't controversial. But this was, just kind of in terms of GDP, obviously huge impact with COVID, as well as, in Kansas, like it was across all other states. But looking at it, Kansas has pretty quickly recovered from that. So from that standpoint, in a better situation than may have hoped a year or so ago. Next slide. Unemployment. Kansas historically has been below the US average. And so unemployment levels have come down, thankfully. But that, the impact has been pretty uneven when you look across different populations and different geographies. Slide 21, from a jobs perspective, looking at the impact on industries. And once again, from allowability standpoint, being able to, invest in industries that have been disproportionately impacted, is an important thing to be able to look at. And a few of them that have been disproportionately impacted, at least so far from a job standpoint in Kansas, are healthcare, manufacturing, and food service, at least, at the point at which this data was looked at and then going back through February 2020. And the next slide, from an innovation standpoint, the need for, in addition to, the need to have a vital, innovation ecosystem, but also understanding the need for skilled workers and upskilling. So if you look at the areas where the greatest number of job openings are, a lot of them tend to be in areas where you require advanced skills, not necessarily advanced degrees, but advanced skills and specialization, areas like healthcare, professional, scientific, and technical services and manufacturing. And so, focusing on this area, at least from the initial feedback that had been gotten in the listening tours and other areas, is a pretty important area. It's come up a lot across Kansas. Next slide. The next slide really looks at, one of the community assets in terms of housing supply, which in some geographies is a limiter for being able to get the talent in to that area in order to fuel the potential business opportunities there. And so as you see, housing availability has decreased over time pretty significantly. And, supply and demand curve is working because the price of homes has risen. So, that is an area of need. The trick is going to be, how you address that catalytically. And then slide 24, finally, and once again, way more detail in the pre-reads, from a business competitiveness standpoint, and this makes the point that Kansas has lost more jobs over 26-year period of time than its peers states from offshoring. But generally, just kind of out-migration is an issue, right? And getting the talent to support the kind of growth engines economically for Kansas going forward seems to be a key area of need. So next slide. So this is, luckily I've done a lot of talking. We're going to pretty quickly get into a group discussion to try and, get where everyone's heads are at from, their just day-to-day perspectives, the pre-reads, getting the juices flowing in this session to start thinking about, where are the areas of greatest need, both within the areas that we've already outlined, as well as suggesting some other areas. Because it wasn't comprehensive. So a few things to think about as we think about investments. It's both in terms where are we investing, as well as what are we investing in. So the types of areas that kind of come up in terms of areas for a recommendation for investment are probably going to have aspects of both of those things. So on this slide. And I think it said, say something potentially in the chat for thoughts about this, but, let me intro the slide and then just open it up for discussion before we get into kind of a more collaborative exercise on a different platform that we can do around this. But if you look at the areas of economic recovery around, assistance to offset near-term and medium-term economic impacts of COVID, growth and competitiveness, strengthening the workforce, enabling skills of the future, particularly in areas that set the workforce up for the future. And then around infrastructure quality, housing, water, sewer, we just kind of open it up in terms of, to anyone, which areas here resonate the most with them from their vantage point and what they've seen. And also, are we missing some things here in terms of areas of focus?
Hi, this is Lana. Do you care who goes first?
Sorry, I muted myself so I wouldn't talk anymore. No, just whoever kind of has something to say, go ahead.
Okay. Oh, surprise! I have something to say. So I obviously I represent more rural Kansas. We're a very fast-growing county, but certainly not a metro area by any stretch. We've talked about outmigration a lot, but quite honestly, we have to be worried about in-migration. We have to be attracting people to the state, not just stopping the flow of people leaving. We have to do better than that, and we've not done a good job of that as a state. Every business I talk to, every community I work with, which is quite a few across central and western Kansas, all of them are saying the same thing: not enough housing, not enough childcare, and those are challenges that are going to thwart our ability to grow in the rural communities, which is most of the counties in Kansas that we're talking about. So I guess when I read this, my thought is, if we really want to change the future of Kansas, we have to do what we can to build that quality of life and that infrastructure, if you will, at the very base of this. And for me, that would mean focusing on getting housing developments going across the state of Kansas, regardless of the size of community, but getting those housing developments out there. My community alone, I have over 3,000 open positions in Finney County. I have 26 people on unemployment benefits in my entire county. 426 people who say they are available to look for work. So, and I right now need 2,000 additional housing units just to fill today's demand before 2030. And I'm 2,400 childcare slots short in my community. So from my standpoint, until we can fix those issues, we're not going to grow business. Businesses aren't going to be able to keep up the pace of growth that we've seen. We grew jobs all throughout the pandemic. We topped out on unemployment at less than 6% at the very worst, because we're a production-based economy. We're not a service-based economy. And we have to pay attention to that. And if we're going to do anything that's going to make a big difference, it's going to be investing in what's going to attract people, bodies, period, to this state who are willing to work.
And one thing I would say, appreciate that, is, that's totally consistent with when I came on board in December, what many, many people had outlined as important needs. On the childcare one, replacing the childcare, at least as the primary emphasis, in the health and education advisory panel. So that is a main focus for that panel to look at. And we're going to be kind of a common point across all of the panels, but the intent is to look at that. Just because you didn't see it here, I just wanted to note that. Anyone else?
Hey, John, Andrew had a question of Lana asking, do you have any needs or recommendations you've heard of to help spark more housing?
Yeah, we have an entire presentation that we'll be submitting. We've worked on this for the last 11 years. So the fact that we have some funds available just helped bring it up to the top, if you will. But yeah, we have a complete plan really for looking at building housing across the state, probably broken down into regions similar to what KDOT is broken down into, so that we ensure that investment is getting to all areas of the state around the cluster communities where they have the opportunity to build the manufacturing and the GDP, making sure that we're investing in the housing and childcare growth all around those cluster communities.
Perfect. Thank you, Lana. And I do want to reiterate her comments about the workforce challenges. Just to let you guys know, in the meeting I had in Q4 of last year, and I'm going to be ballpark here so you can get the overall sentiment, but I believe we had 30 to 35,000 Kansans on unemployment. And the Kansas workforce website that we post opening jobs for the state, and any private or non-public entity could post their jobs there. We had roughly 60,000 job postings. And statistically, we think there's probably 2 additional jobs for every job that's on that website that isn't being posted. So we definitely have a human capital challenge in our great state. So I would, what you say, Lana, resonates with me. And we do need to address those issues, but just wanted to share some high level statistics there.
And I would piggyback onto that. I think you're low on your estimate that it's only 2 jobs that each one is representing. We did follow-ups with all of our electronically advertised employers and found most of them were actually had open positions of at least 10, but only had 1 advertisement out. But most of them were in the 20s number of positions they would hire if they could get that many applicants, but they only advertised for 1 job, obviously. So yeah, we would agree. We think it's off to a factor of 3 or 4, and we're nowhere near being able to fill those positions.
Thank you. Now, there's a lot of great ED people and private sector people on here. So you guys got to jump on here and please share with us your expertise and your opinions.
Well, Tim, I guess, and I apologize, I'm gonna have to jump in a second. A lot of things swirling around my head. I mean, I get maybe access being in Overland Park, kind of Fairway area, kind of more regional, which includes Missouri, right? Greater Kansas City. And I know Mark just put out a Mid-America Regional Council just put out a stat that there's 92,000 open positions in the Greater Kansas City area, which is whatever percentage. Part of that's Kansas, right? Part of that's Missouri, but it's indicative of, I think, a situation we're all having on the private side. We did a ton of work here the last decade to try to create this ecosystem in Kansas City that we could attract startups, specifically in the tech sector, and work with the universities to get kids ready for those opportunities, and have been just punished in the last 2 years with the fact that now we're seeing East and West Coast firms come in and get my Kansas City engineers and give them a $50,000 raise, which is a $50,000 pay cut than they were having in Menlo Park. And I get it, so we had built up this great kind of pretty decent subset of software engineers that were doing great work, and they're getting told to stay in Prairie Village, but work for the Menlo Park firm, and you can stay here. And so it's not even showing up as far as like those people are employed, but Kansas companies that are going to be, I think, the real catalyst of good jobs and sustainable companies here. We're in a tough spot to try to keep that tech talent, that kind of forward-thinking tech talent, and get enough applicants to fill the opportunities that are before us. And it gets, I'm not trying to be like dramatic, it gets really sexy to think about going and opening an office in Dallas or Menlo Park to be able to recruit that person and keep them in your organization, even if they don't live in Kansas. We want to stay here, we want to grow this thing here, but there's a real need as far as high-end talent for organizations like ours to be sustained and be a big driver of employment in Kansas right now that we got to get fixed.
Thank you for sharing. And I agree 100%. I'm probably going to agree with all of you guys 100% for the most part.
Tim, this is Tim McKee. Workforce development, obviously you've talked about it, but any initiative around workforce development or things that might hit those issues that we've talked about around workforce development. And I don't know what those, I'm, excited to hear some of the proposals that might come from, businesses, community colleges, things like that might come in is, long-term transformative initiatives around workforce development, not one-time hits, but long-term initiatives, maybe a training center for spirit, something like that, around that. And I'm not tied to any part of the state. I'm not looking for just Johnson County. I'm hoping that some of these initiatives are out and everywhere across the state. So just excited to hear some of the proposals.
Yeah, from my understanding, we obviously have Wichita State Tech in the South Central region, who works really hand in hand with all the major manufacturers in the greater Wichita area on skilled labor, right? I mean, and there's a lot of initiatives out there from WSU Tech to Micro Works actually operates in the greater Wichita area, a small little initiative as well. From a state level, I will actually defer to John, and then I also know Bill's on the call too. So Bill, if you're aware of anything else, but I'm assuming all of you ED experts in the regional areas are aware of what's happening in your region in our state.
I don't really have anything to add to what's been said. I do know that there's a lot of issues around workforce development, a lot of funding requests about trying to upskill the workers that are here in Kansas for more advanced jobs, and whether it's manufacturing or other kinds of jobs. So I think that there's an effort to try to take what we've got and move them up the pay scale, if you will, in terms of abilities and to improve our ability to attract new employers to the state. So, or fill the jobs that are here, frankly. So, other than that, I can't tell you what's out there beyond what you all know about.
Thank you, Bill. Any other insights from our other ED experts?
I'm not an ED expert, but if I could just throw out a quick comment at the end. But I also agree with a lot of what's been said. As I look at our industry in the aerospace and defense side, and I'm saying that not just right in it's obviously concentrated a lot of that in Wichita, but like I said, we have suppliers across the state. Like everyone has said, finding the right talent is extremely difficult right now. And just our company alone, we've shared publicly that we've got several thousand employees that we're going to be hiring over the next few years to get back up to where we need to be in production rates. And that doesn't, touch on, again, any of our suppliers in the region or across the state that are also going to have to do the same thing as they ramp up. I don't want to get too granular with this, but one of the ideas that's been tossed around here in Wichita for a couple of years, we were actually pursuing some things before the pandemic hit. But we've got to do something in the state to bring more people in. And I think Lana, you said that earlier. It's not just about training. I mean, that's a component of it to make sure that the people we have here have the skills necessary. But it's getting more people to come to the state. And one of the areas that we identified that I think could have a broad impact is in the areas of veterans. So you think about kind of two sectors here. You've got bases here in Kansas, where you've got military personnel and their families, right, where they're getting ready to retire from military service. And we have a big population of people there every year who are going to enter into the private sector. And so a lot of times we'll lose those people who are based here in Kansas because they're returning to, right, their home states, or for whatever reason they don't feel like there are opportunities here in Kansas, and they leave. But then we also have, right, tens of thousands of potential retirees from the military branches who are in bases across the United States and around the globe. And we don't really have any, mechanism to do recruitment from all those retiring service personnel and their spouses and families. And I think we view that as kind of some low-hanging fruit as an opportunity for being able to bring highly skilled and talented personnel who are leaving government sector side and bring them into the private sector to help fill a wide range of roles across industry. So yeah, I like these categories. And I think that from my knot hole, that workforce piece stands out as a really big need.
Thank you, Sam. And I want to throw out there too, I work with several organizations. There's a big also initiative, at least at the national level, on second chance hiring as well for some certain skill sets. So there's a huge untapped population. And SHRM actually has come on board now, and they actually have a second chance hiring package if for all those in ED in the private sector. If they're not aware of that, you could actually reach out to your local SHRM office and they can give you a second chance hiring package. And I think there's a military one too. So that would be something for everyone to consider on the workforce piece, but all great stuff so far.
Ken, this is Andrew with the Greater Wichita Partnership. I wholeheartedly agree with kind of the comments that have been kind of thrown out before. One of the things, because the kind of question at hand on the discussion slide there is kind of where we think these three kind of categories. I don't have an objection with any of these necessarily. I guess the one that stands out to me is for question though would be the infrastructure. There's a lot of infrastructure needs in our state. Water and sewer, I can get my head around. Those are kind of core civil infrastructure projects. I assume, maybe inappropriately, but I assume that that's a function of, to some degree, housing is limited by the amount of new sewer taps and water lines. To some degree, maybe it's a function that there's, road and highway infrastructure threaded across other forms of stimulus and other buckets of fed and state money. But to me, it seems a little unique, and I'm just curious, John and staff, to kind of hear how that kind of made its way through the process, or maybe Mr. Pickard, that came from the Spark Committee. So that's one that I don't necessarily disagree with it. It's just a curiosity to me. But the one suggestion I would make in terms of, are there any topics outside that aren't maybe, and I know we've all been dancing around it, but to me, I would really underscore and reinforce the industry focus, that we can't be all things to all people. How do we underline and reinforce the industries that not only we have a competitive advantage in the state, and we're very good. We have a broad category of industries that we compete with. Now, advanced manufacturing lives all across the state. The professional services is very strong, the northeast corner of the state. I mean, we have a wide variety of industries that we excel at. How do we double down on those competitive advantages? But then also, how do we take leaps forward with the sectors that are shifting and evolving? And Sam could speak far better than I could in how aerospace is dramatically changing, and Spirit is leading that in many regards. So I look at an opportunity for kind of reinforcement on industry focus. And I'm a little curious as to the infrastructure, why water and sewer, to use the pun, kind of bubbled up there. So those are my questions and comments.
Pun intended, I think. Water and sewer were actually explicitly outlined in the allowability guidelines as being allowed, and had also seen some proposals around that from the previous year as well around water and sewer. But it's something where there's kind of a clear path from an allowability standpoint. So put it here.
Is that to say, John, sorry to interrupt you, is that to say other types of infrastructure were explicitly eliminated or discouraged?
No, but this was specifically mentioned.
Okay.
John, I have a question, and just initially I thought there was some issues around travel and tourism. I'm just curious if that is not a part of what we're doing, or is that somewhere else, or is that not on the list here? And I don't have, I was just curious.
Yeah. Support for travel and tourism could be an explicit place to focus, particularly as it was impacted by COVID. And there is some mention of that as well within the allowability. So yes. Yeah. Yeah, I saw a comment from some of the support groups saying that that would actually be something that they might even see in economic recovery, because that was an area that was impacted disproportionately by COVID, a sector. So, one of the suggestions I'd make now is let's go to that kind of collaboration board, because I think that might help.
Hey, John.
Yeah, sure.
One more quick comment before we do that. As we're thinking about these categories, and this may be a consultant question more than directed toward you, but I'm curious, as other states are also going through processes to decide how they're going to allocate their dollars, if we have any insights into some of those states where they're taking early actions, are these, categories kind of aligned with what I would call, a best practice, or states where we would look to for being innovative? Are we missing anything? Are missing any opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, not all the states have declared at a specific level what they're focusing on yet, but some certainly have. And the intent in all the pre-reads was to provide examples where we saw them. And we're going to continue to be focusing on that, because there actually is a database across the states of where they're focusing. And they're focusing across a lot of these things. But I think in a lot of areas, these may be the areas of focus that come last in some of those states, because they're probably looking at some of the broadband issues and the healthcare and education issues, because they're carryover from the previous rounds of funding. But generally, the categories that we're looking at here are the ones that, from what we've seen to date, most of the states have been focusing on at a broad level. Haven't gotten below and say, okay, do they have a better mousetrap for addressing any of these yet? That would be some follow-on research potentially you might be able to bring to the table.
John, and I think Anna might have mentioned this in the chat, but I believe you sent a document to Representative Tarwater and I about best practices. And we use that term loosely, guys, because keep in mind, right, there's committees like us elsewhere, and they're starting to allocate those funds, but those funds really don't have enough span of implementation yet to be determined whether it's a best practice or not. So at least we can identify the sectors that are being invested in. And from the staff's comments, it seems like we're pretty consistent with that. But from an overall best practice, time will tell, and we just don't have enough of a sample size yet to see that. But Anna or John or somebody on the staff side, can we make sure to send that document or put that in our Microsoft Teams page or whatever file sharing folder that we'll have? That'd be great.
Sure. And the other thing is, when we focus in on a few areas, then we can look at, not linked necessarily to this set of funds, we could look at things, best practices that other states have been doing to address these issues, right? Even outside of where they may have spent funds here, because that may be early on for some of them. But, in a lot of these areas, these kind of systemic opportunities and needs, this could be an area where, looking at them and providing more innovative solutions, could be a interesting avenue to go down in some of these. So. Okay, could we switch to the collaboration board? So is everyone seeing this?
Yeah, so I just sent a link and a password in the chat. So if folks want to click on that link and then enter the password, you should be seeing what I'm seeing on my screen of this board here, and then we'll explain some instructions.
Okay, and I'm not going to be voting, so I'll be seeing what you're seeing regardless, right?
Yep.
Great. So this is a fairly new platform for me as well, but it's a collaborative platform to be able to, begin to work together visually around just getting a feel for, are we kind of complete in the areas that we're looking at? And so, adding tiles where it makes sense to add tiles. Within a tile, we can even start adding some examples of what are some of the things that could be done in those areas, as well as the ability to just kind of vote against some of those things. So what I would suggest is let's spend maybe about 3 or 4 minutes and look at the tiles. And then if you can think of any suggestions of things that may be missing, let us know. And then once we've kind of corrected this to reflect those comments, assume everyone has kind of 5 votes. You could place all 5 within a tile. What you may be able to do, Sam, is just verbally tell us then, and we'll kind of allocate your votes or add some things. And then you could put all 5 votes in one tile or distribute them across various tiles, but just to kind of get an indication from the group collaboratively, where are the areas that are of the, people think, the greatest need and opportunity is. And then, on some of the ones where we see a lot of emphasis, we can even focus in on maybe what some of the potential solutions might be against some of those tiles.
So the basic premise, just because I'm an idiot about technology, we just hit the thumbs up on each one. Is that the general gist?
Yeah, the one thing I'd say is exactly just hit a thumbs up, and you can hit it 5 times if you want to. But first, look at these categories, and I just suggest, it's 321 now. Look at them till like 324, 325, and as you're thinking about things that might be missing, just vocalize that, and we'll add tiles.
And I think you all might have permission to add cards. So if you think of something that's missing, feel free to hit the plus button right here at the top of the category. And I think you should be able to add a card.
Let's keep broadband here, but keep in mind there's an advisory panel the connectivity advisory panel is totally focused on broadband, so we won't miss it. But it's good to tag it here because that is going to be an enabler for a lot of things from an economy standpoint, also from a delivery of social services and a quality of life.
Remind me, is it 5 per each color or 5 total?
5 total.
Okay, thank you.
Looks like availability and affordability is an early leader. On the support for hard hit sectors, if people can include in the comments if they have an idea on which sectors in particular, right? They can add a comment.
Yep. Yeah, you can add a comment to the cards, I think.
So just to check, does anyone need Anna to, if they're having trouble accessing, kind of put their votes down for them?
I can put mine in the chat.
Okay.
I can try to put your votes in.
Has everyone had a chance to weigh in at this point? Has anyone not weighed in? That's probably easier. No? So now that, go ahead.
Oh, I apologize, John. I was going to say, given the scale of the voting for housing, I'd be curious if it's maybe a future meeting to kind of break the data down a little more.
Mhm.
But is it equal availability, or is it affordability? Is it, 50-50 both, or is it, 99% availability? I'm just curious. I know it's a need in our part of the state too, but it's such a wide ranging topic. I'm curious what's most important.
I guess I just asked the group now, when they were putting their votes down, were they differentiating, or did they think it was equally for both?
Honestly, from our standpoint, any housing we build is going to create better affordability. When you're talking the kind of shortages that we're seeing literally all across, especially again, the rural parts of the state, just building new units, regardless of how much the new unit costs, is going to open up additional units. And we're never going to be able to build entry level. What people think is entry level, that has to come from existing housing stock freeing up, because there's an opportunity for folks to get through the housing funnel, if you will. So I would say affordability takes care of itself when we get, when we get numbers matching what the demand is.
How do people think about the things that rose to the top here in terms of business space, support for hard hit sectors, which you need to kind of dive into more, industry development, which I think is kind of probably linked a little bit potentially even, not in all cases, but to support for hard hit sectors, depending on what falls in there, upskilling, reskilling, domestic talent recruitment, workforce retention, housing availability, a couple of votes for water infrastructure. Anything here surprising, folks, or seems about right?
John, I assume that aid to small business has kind of been maybe addressed in other areas or before. Is that maybe why we're not seeing it? And I didn't put it there either, mainly because our counties and our cities maybe have addressed it. I want to make sure that we don't receive criticism for it, that we address it. And I just want to make sure that I assume that's why we are all not going in that direction.
Well, there could be that, and it could be that, tiles that got added later may have already had people voting on other stuff too. So there could be that a little bit too, but there has been aid to small businesses. But
Tim, I'll just give you my opinion was the former, was that there has been a number of resources, and not to say that every business, every sector, every niche, small business has been, given every opportunity, but I think in the grand scheme of what we could advance, there's some other areas that would be more important.
I would agree on that. With Triple P and EIDL that's gone through, there's been a significant amount of support. Now, could there be more? Absolutely. But we also know we're working with limited funds here and just trying to determine what's going to make the greatest impact at the stage that we're in now.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think we're past crisis point. I don't talk to businesses that are afraid they're not going to be able to stay open at this point. As a matter of fact, quite the opposite. They don't know how the heck they're going to find enough employees to manage the growth that they have. But again, if we're talking sustainable growth, if we're talking these are dollars we've never had before, and the opportunities to do real impactful investments that make a difference long term are going to require that those funds be directly allocated toward tangible assets that will build this state, not pie in the sky programming stuff that we can't truly measure as far as whether or not it made a change.
And just to play off what Lana just said, that I didn't click on that because I'm thinking that doesn't strike me as something that builds a foundation for long-term economic growth. I agree we're kind of past aid to any particular sector like that.
Yeah, I guess if you look at the votes, the total votes that went into economic recovery versus the total votes that went into infrastructure quality and growth and competitiveness, granted there were more tiles in growth and competitiveness, but you definitely see, kind of more of the emphasis on the things as you move farther to the right. And once again, the broadband piece is going to be covered by, is being covered by another panel.
Lana, not to steal your thunder of your sounds like innovative housing proposal, but I've read the state's recently released housing study, and I have opinions on it, but I'm curious what you're hearing and your opinion on why it didn't come up very high in these tile rankings. Water and sewer infrastructure a limiting factor to housing availability, or is it the state's housing plan talks about the lack of home builders? And kind of what's your silver bullet kind of take on how to address housing availability?
Yeah, like I said, I think if we kind of force the developer, and when I say force, I mean give him a carrot, right? I think if we create opportunities, you may have communities. You've traveled all over out here, Andrew. You're well aware of what the layout is like out here. I have workers who come in from a 16 county area to work in my community every day. They're driving in to do that. Those communities aren't going to be able to attract industry. They're not going to get an advanced manufacturer, but their growth is still dependent on the fact that I can. So I think in some of those communities, there may be some of that infrastructure requirement for housing, but pretty limitedly, I would say. I think on the federal level, when they put that in as a specific allowable expense, I think we can point to a lot of areas where that's a real issue. And we hear about it plenty, Flint, Michigan, our Indian reservations come to mind. There's a lot of places where we just don't have that good infrastructure. But I think what we really have to focus on is giving a developer a reason to come out. And again, that's why I really like the idea of doing it in regions, much like we have KDOT broken out. If we can get a guy, he may only be building 20 units in 4 or 5 communities, but he's going to be building 50 or 100 in a couple of others. So just getting to that point where there's enough development to make it worth their time and effort to come out and put together good packages for materials and that kind of thing. I think that's where we have to focus on in the rural communities. I would tell you that's where we have to focus on housing. And again, I would really like to see us partner up with that, push the idea over to the education committee that when we're building those housing subdivisions, just like we're doing in Finney County, that's the opportunity to say, build a childcare in that facility, in that housing development, you put in a childcare as we go, so we can get caught up on childcare as we go. And I think that's one of those areas where we can definitely cross sector and partner with another task force to make that happen.
Hey, John, I just want to do a quick time check and check with the agenda to make sure that we're on track and be respectful of everybody's time for our 4 o'clock stop.
Yeah, what I'd say is that, this has been a really great discussion and this has been a good tool. I had no idea how it would work. But, we probably should move on. I think this, though, is something that, as we regroup, Tim, with the representative, we're going to need to think about, how this will impact what we're going to be looking at over the next few weeks before the next session, or next week or so before the next session. And what I would say here is, we're going to be able to revisit this again in the next session, and maybe, and by then should even see some of the submissions and whether that changes our thinking. But we're going to also be thinking about, and you should be too, any expert resources to bring to bear, particularly against the things that are the, getting the most energy. And we're also going to be looking at that as well to bring more information to bear around them. The housing availability and affordability one for sure. Looking at examples, and regardless of whether it's tied to this source of funding or not, that's happening in other states around how they've tried to address that, would probably be a good area for us to try and kind of pull in some more information into this process. And we'll look at a few of the other areas as well. That makes sense. Okay. Great. Well, good. I thought that was a good exercise. So in terms of looking at, the path forward, and we're already beginning to touch on that. Through this. Sorry. Once again, I mentioned the submission form before. That's been publicized as online. And we already are starting to get submissions. We're going to be kind of looking at the submissions coming in and doing weekly downloads of those into the team sites for each one of the panels, so that you'll be able to see kind of periodic uploads of what we're seeing come in. And we can start thinking about where those fit against some of these priority areas, or maybe even whether some of them make us rethink some of the priority areas. Next slide. As I talked about before, there is a Microsoft Teams folder for every one of the advisory panels, this one included. I believe that the link on this slide actually is a live link to it, but we're also emailing the links out to folks. And that's places where, once again, we're going to load up the proposal submissions as they come in. Once we've had it, they'll probably come in batches. And then be able to find all the member resources, onboarding materials, pre-reads, any other logistics information, and also contact info for any of the support resources. I'd also say, if you have any questions or any suggestions that are specific, come to me or come to anyone, come to the chairs or anyone else on the panel. Like I said before, the only thing I know about this process is that we can't have planned it all out perfectly. We're going to need to adjust based on kind of where this discussion goes. And, that's within the control of the panel. So the next slide, this kind of outlines, where we're going next. And so if that next session, probably likely happen on the 18th, we're going to work to kind of make sure that, we check with the chairs that, that's okay, and kind of just check the availability again, but that seemed to be kind of a good landing spot. That's when we'd be able to start as a group previewing the emerging submissions, brainstorm around the key areas of focus, incremental and transformational solutions within those areas. We're going to, against the things we just talked about, try and bring information to bear against that for us to look at. Hopefully get that out early for people to look at. I would say any of you that have thoughts around that, definitely get to us on that. Align on the key investment ideas for a deeper dive and build out, and preview the filtering criteria, the ideas templates, so that as we're looking within the areas of focus to really, across all the areas, to think about, how are we going to score things in terms of importance, so that as the panel is looking at the portfolio, they can make apples to apples comparisons across the ideas. So in terms of the homework between now and then, review the process, overview the pre-reads, the fact packs, any other shared materials, individually brainstorm, gather ideas from relevant stakeholders, particularly against the places that had the most emphasis from the team perspective today. And identify any other experts to engage, and that's something we haven't talked about quite as much. So, to the extent that you can think of experts to bring to bear against this, and we'll be thinking of it on our side as well, that would be helpful. And we could either bring their thinking into the sessions, bring them into the sessions, or even have webinars in between the scheduled sessions for people to be able to attend. But, we can remain flexible there around making sure that we're bringing in the right expertise against the most important areas. And I think I already mentioned this before in terms of, what we're going to be looking to do for the next session. One thing that we would like everyone to do is to complete this exit survey. So once again, and we'll email this out as well, in the spirit of adjusting and improving, we want to get from everyone on the panel, what worked, what didn't work, what could we do to make this process better going forward. So would really appreciate everyone's input there. It's not going to be process, I'm sure, isn't perfect now, but we can make it better and better as we go along with everyone's input. So with that, that's kind of all in terms of the kind of official slides to go through. I guess at this point, I'd open it up again. We have a little bit more time, don't need to hold people, particularly since it's a Friday afternoon, longer than they need to be held. But, this might be a good time to kind of open it up to discussion questions again.
Just one quick thing as well. I'm putting the exit survey in the chat, and this will also be in a follow-up email that we'll be sending out this afternoon. But it'd be great to hear from you, what you thought of today's session, what we can do in the future to make this more successful, and topics you think would be great to have some experts on. So if you wouldn't mind filling that out at some point in the coming days, that would be great.
Yeah, and one thing I'd say, I'm super impressed with the level of passion and collaboration, engagement in the session. So, so thank you for that. I think we got it getting off to a great start here, and I know that we're going to, make a lot of progress pretty quickly. So,
John, I have another question. You had put in there, the Cora Open Records information on that. Is our future meetings, are they open to anyone? Are these going to be taped? And then you had mentioned they were going to be taped. Yeah. And then how does that work as we're having our debates and discussion? Yeah. Will there be outside folks watching, or how will that work?
They'll be streamed. This one's being streamed. So, but not a lot of people may watch it on the stream, but they'll be recorded as well for anyone to view, as well as for if you can't make it to a session, you'll be able to catch up by seeing the session. So yeah, other people will be seeing it. Yeah.
On where, if I can ask a follow on to that, can you remind us where are these accessed from?
That would be a more technical question. So I'd ask someone on the support team to point people in the right direction on that.
Yeah, so they're coming from the Office of Recovery YouTube channel. I can put the link in the chat as well if that's helpful, but they're being streamed on YouTube.
Hey, Anna, can you send the link? Can we create a folder of each meeting in our Teams office or in our Teams folder and just date the link that way? If someone misses it, they can just go to our Teams, click on that, and it'll take them to that meeting they missed.
Yep. Yeah, we can do that. And we'll also include the link to today's recording in the email that we send this afternoon following up.
Perfect. And so just a couple housekeeping items I have. Oh, go ahead, Andrew.
No, I can wait, Tim. Go ahead.
Just a couple of housekeeping items. We talked about best practices from other states in regards to the buckets and the categories that we've gotten from our consultants here. They'll be sending that out or dropping it into our Teams folder. And so once again, driving home the importance to make sure that you click on the Teams link and you have access and you can view everything. If you can't, please reach out to staff and let them know. Don't forget the survey. As they mentioned, we're always trying to get better. And so your feedback so that we can adjust on the fly is going to be greatly appreciated. It looks like I just want to drive home 2016 or 216 is the date of the last submission or the deadline submission. And so we're going to have a meeting, I believe, roughly shortly after that. The team will look at our calendars again based on the availability that we shared and send out a meeting invite early next week early to mid next week and get at least the next 2 meetings on our calendar. And we've mentioned this a couple of times, but like expertise needed. If we have any kind of research that we need to do, the team can provide any analytical data that they have access to, or they could chase that down for us. I would anticipate that we'll need more subject matter experts once we start reviewing some of these submissions. So don't feel like there's a need or a push to understand what experts we want right away. So after our initial review for submissions, we can then come back to the staff to request, hey, this made the short list. Can we get some subject matter experts to deep dive that for us? So those are just some of the housekeeping items that I had. And of course, open it up to any other questions.
Well, Ryan raised his hand, so go ahead, Ryan.
Hey, Tim, since you mentioned the application process, I'm curious what level of specificity we should anticipate. Are these going to be detailed submissions? Are these 30,000 foot submissions? And kind of what is our role in going through a very detailed report?
Ryan, if you haven't clicked on the submission form that we've sent out, or if we haven't sent that to you, we definitely need to get it to you. There's minimum words or maximum words allowed. There's different check boxes they can. So it's a very uniform format. We anticipate it's going to be really high level documentation, 30,000 foot level. And as we, shorten that list, we can actually go back to the submission applicant to request further details, but they do have options to put any kind of supporting documents in that their initial submission. But if we want to request more data, we definitely can reach out to that applicant and get that. John, is there anything you want to add to that, John?
No, that's correct. We wanted to make it, not as high table stakes for being able to submit an idea, but we wanted people to be pretty specific about it, right? But as we, move farther down the process, we'll work with them to detail them out more.
What we didn't want was one applicant to give us a 2-page application and then another applicant to give us like a 50-page application. So that's why we created that form.
Thanks, Dan. I was just going to say, I'll add this to the feedback and maybe the suggestion in the teams, but I think I don't know if it's expertise or subject matter experts, but I think some perspective on some of the other documentation, given the depth of the conversation this afternoon about housing, the statewide housing study, I think was referenced. I think also kind of whether it's Build Back Better from a federal perspective, some of us, I know I have just a fraction amount of knowledge of the federal infrastructure bill, but clearly that's, I think, going to have some overlap potentially with some of these infrastructure projects. So having that clarity as this group tries to prioritize to shift on to the executive committee priorities, again, what we're saying yes to, there's other things we're saying no to. So the federal transportation bill, I think, would be helpful. And then also, I think by the time we meet next, we will at least have more clarity on some of the allocations the Spark Executive Committee made already on economic development with the base grant program that has been, I know, just kind of launched this last week. And that largely speaks to kind of business park development, spec building, kind of business infrastructure. So I think having any clarity that this staff and this group can get on the base program would also be good. And last comment, I'll just say I'm super jazzed about the fact that they wish I would have known earlier in the meeting. I would have said a lot more, been a lot crazier knowing that this is on YouTube and my son is going to watch this. So I finally get to be a YouTuber. This is awesome.
John and staff, can you make sure that we get some documentation on what the base grant program is addressing so that we don't overlap? So this panel has a good basis there.
We'll have wherever it stands at that point in time. So, yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Anything else?
Well, just to Andrew's point, I know RDG has done our housing study in Finney County for a long, long time. And I know Amy Hayes with RDG would be more than happy to come on and explore some of the ideas that they talked about for, really for every size community. They have some really good ideas about where capital injection could really make a difference. And I know she'd be happy to do that.
Great. Well, with that, it seems like we're running out of steam a little bit. Appreciate everyone's involvement. Tim, I don't know if you have any kind of closing thoughts.
No, other than just an honor and all the gratitude in the world to be serving with you guys. And, this is very generational. We'll never see, at least I hope not, a need for something like this where people like us are being trusted and given the responsibility and task to be good stewards of such massive funds that really can impact our great state for generations to come. So it's an honor and a privilege to go through this process with you guys.